What did you come through to wear with me?
All stand. Coronial Court is now in session. Please be seated. Mr. Officer.
Your Honour, I hand to you two articles, two printouts. Please, I circulate that to the parties.
Yes.
Dealing with the first one, Your Honour, what I have provided to you is a copy of the hard copy of that particular newspaper, where there is a photo, the name of, and the description of in the third column on the left, which in my respectful submission infringes on everyone's non-publication order that was made yesterday. I understand it's gone wider to other newspaper outlets, but this one is concerning in particular because it is in hard copy print, and I understand that moments ago it was still in its online form as well, and so the control over that is somewhat difficult to contain. Nonetheless, Your Honour, I raise it that it is a breach of the non-publication order that was made yesterday and has caused some distress to my client and his family.
I'm sorry to hear that. I do understand that unfortunately, given the interruption of the technical difficulties, we neglected to confirm the order that had been made once we went live, and I can only apologise for trying to keep on top of these matters.
Your Honour, I accept the apology from the court, and it might be best that the non-publication order is put into writing.
We are attending to that now.
I'll just remind my friend, I mean, nobody put it on the record. I take full responsibility for it, but nobody else put it on the record either when we went on the live stream. So that would be helpful. And I can assure my friend, as soon as it was drawn to our attention, we tried to do what was necessary last night to withdraw it. But it's perhaps a timely reminder to everybody.
But if there is still an online version that is inaccurate, then we can request our media liaison person to identify that and ask it to be dealt with.
That's what happened last night, Your Honour, and I understand
yes,
that.
I understand, Mr. Officer, that there might still be one online version that hasn't been addressed.
But that's right, Your Honour, and certainly the hard copy print of the newspaper.
It's hard to deal with that one.
It is, Your Honour. The second article I bring to your attention from the Canberra Times, Your Honour, the issue I take with that is the gross misreporting that has been put into that article in the headline and in the caption under the photograph. As Your Honour will recall, the evidence yesterday, there was no such evidence of that adduced, and there is no such evidence on the brief of what is put in that headline and in that caption in existence.
Yes.
I raise that in the context, Your Honour, that it is perhaps a timely reminder to the organisations who are printing or running articles on these sensitive issues, as was raised yesterday in my application for non-publication, to faithfully and accurately report. Not only is that headline and the caption grossly inaccurate, it is disturbing and causes distress to my client as well, but I'm sure it will probably cause distress to the family if that is what is being reported and being peddled, which is not correct at all. And that's quite a significant error to make in the context of this case, and I bring it up to your attention simply as a time of reminder about faithful reporting on these issues.
Yes, and of course, the processes that we're adopting, live streaming and publishing transcript, should enable all agencies to accurately report on these proceedings.
Thank you.
Your Honour, all I can do is agree with my learned friend with respect to that Canberra Times article and the heading. That is inaccurate. And Dr Freckleton drew Your Honour's attention at the very beginning to some inaccurate reporting in another publication there's a limit. In fact, Your Honour has no power to do anything about that other than to remind everybody.
Reiterate that we are operating in a very transparent fashion for the broader community and to assist accuracy in relation to communicating what is occurring in these proceedings.
Thank you, Your Honour. Can I invite my learned friend, Mr Officer, and anybody else at the bar table who becomes aware of any inaccuracy in reporting to let Ms Walls know so that we can get onto the media team at the Coroner's Office and then contact the online publishers as soon as possible?
Yes, sure. And I certainly tried to look up the contact details of that particular author. This happens to be the same author for both articles. I don't have any fruit in that sense. So otherwise I would have contacted the author myself. Thank you, Your Honour.
We do have media liaison to assist with communicating non-publication orders and to assist with correcting any issues that we are notified of, and we'll continue to do that. And I heartily support Councillor Sisting's suggestion that if any matters of concern arise, please feel free to raise it, and also please feel free to raise it if you identify, for example, that we have missed a non-publication order, putting on the live screen or putting it on the website, or any other orders that are made, so that we can do our best to assist the accuracy of the communication of these matters. Mr Coleridge.
Good morning, Your Honour. The next witness is Mr Bruce Van Heften. He will be giving evidence by live stream from Darwin. He did in fact attend yesterday. I call Bruce Van Heften.
Mr Van Heften, thank you for making yourself available today. I understand that you were also available and had travelled yesterday. I do apologise. We are trying to keep to a tight schedule, and unfortunately we failed to meet that schedule when we had you planned, and I apologise, but I very much appreciate that you've made yourself available again today. Before you give any evidence, do you promise to tell the truth to the court? You're on mute on your end.
Can you hear me now, Your Honour?
Loud and clear. And was that a yes to that promise?
That was a yes.
Thank you.
Mr Van Heften, can you please state your full name for the record?
My full name is Bruce Allen Van Heften.
And you provided a statutory declaration in these proceedings, is that correct?
Correct.
Your Honour, that's dated the 12th of October 2020, and it's at brief item 10-22 capital A. Now, Mr Van Heften, you didn't provide these further documents, but am I right that you've reviewed a number of further documents that were contained in Constable Groff's recruitment file?
That's correct.
And you may or may not know that those documents were annexed to Kevin Agnew's statement.
I didn't know that.
And Your Honour, that statement is 7-1. For the record, the annexures to that statement are provided in somewhat jumbled way. I've extracted some of the more important documents and I'll show them to the witness if necessary, but that's where they come from.
Thank you.
Mr Van Heften, can you tell Her Honour something about your qualifications?
I'm a registered psychologist, a generally registered psychologist, and I've been working as a psychologist since the early 2000s, both within correctional settings, community mental health, for a period of nearly 10 years, police fire and emergency services. Recently with Veterans Affairs, within Open Arms, and currently at Darwin.
Can I ask you to repeat the last bit? I'm struggling to hear you.
I currently work at Charles Darwin University within the clinical training team.
And what are you doing at Charles Darwin?
I am the clinical manager of the Wellness Centre Psychology Service, which is the training for postgraduate clinical psychologists.
Now, I take it that you worked for approximately 20 years as a psychologist across different NT government departments, is that right?
That's correct.
You started working with young offenders, doing offence-related treatment and the like, is that correct?
Correct. And then with adult offenders within the Berrimah Correctional Centre.
You then became involved with the Northern Territory Police Fire and Emergency Services, is that correct?
That's correct.
In
early
what?
2000. As a psychologist within the Employee Support Services team
In what year?
in 2000.
You're breaking up a little bit. That sometimes happens on Teams, we've found. We might try the phone call method.
Mr. Van Haften, we might try to dial you in by telephone.
We'll keep you on visually on the screen, but we might get you on the phone for audio.
Thank you. I'm finding it very difficult with all the background noise in the court to hear as well.
Okay, well, maybe the phone will work better for both.
We might need a moment to set that up, Your Honour. I'm sorry to ask.
I don't think so. We just need a number. When we get you on the phone, we'll just ask you to mute your computer.
Yes, Your Honour.
Mr. Van Haften, can you mute
Hello. I've muted my computer.
Great.
All right, Mr. Van Haften, can you hear me?
Yes.
You might have to pick up that phone and have it a bit closer to you.
Yep. Sorry. I can hear clearly now.
Look,
Is that going to work with you holding it like that, or do you want to put it, just see if you can get it a bit closer to you on, or do you have headphones?
I think I've managed it now to get it on speakerphone and manage the computer. Can you hear me clearly now?
That's pretty good.
all right, let's give it a go. All right, so we were up to, I think 2008 or 2009, you just joined the Northern Territory Police Fire and Emergency Services as a psychologist. How long were you a psychologist with PFES?
So I was in the role as a psychologist for approximately 5 years, and then I transitioned to the role of manager for the Employee Support Services team for the remainder of the time I was with Police Fire and Emergency Services. And that was the position titled Assistant Director, Employee Support Principal Psychologist.
And then in 2018, you spent some time working with the Department of Veterans Affairs.
That's correct.
And now you're at Charles Darwin University.
Correct.
Okay. I want to ask you some questions about your role at Police, Fire and Emergency Services, beginning with, I suppose, the direct clinical work you might have done as a psychologist. What did that involve in terms of, face-to-face clinical work?
So a component of that work included early intervention clinical screening with personnel, mostly police officers at that level. It involved providing crisis support to employees across the Tri-Service, including the police force and their family members, and it included the provision of psychological treatment, primarily in that case to personnel of the organisation.
I use the expression early intervention. What does that mean?
So, in the context of Northern Territory Police, that was a service that was called well checks, where there was periodic screening with personnel that were considered to be working within higher risk work units, instigated by those work units, where we would make contact with the personnel at structured intervals, 3 months, 6 months or 12 monthly, to screen for early indications of heightened stress or distress, burnout, for trauma reactions, and to ensure that personnel in those work units were mindful of options for support and for treatment.
You're also involved in training and the development of policy, is that right?
So within the psychology role, that would have incorporated delivering training in relation to mental health issues, and also delivering information sessions about services that were available and the function of services. And in my latter tenure with NT, Police Fire and Emergency Services, it would have included the development of service policy and governance, and also in the design of services that were relevant for both early intervention and resilience and clinical services that could be provided to personnel and their families.
Was there any element of operational support, either in your role as a psychologist or as your role as Assistant Director of the ESS?
At different levels. So there would have been a component of that included providing consultation services to managers or command about how best to support personnel through training or through direct service delivery or through arrangements for visiting to remote areas. And on some specific occasions, the psychologists within the employee support team at that point in time also provided a mental health consultation service to the police negotiation team, where we provided information on mental health specific issues to guide their decision making.
That information that you'd provide to the police negotiation team, I take it that you weren't becoming involved in individual negotiations with individual offenders, is that right?
Now, we did not advise about how to proceed in the police negotiation activities, but if there was a question, say, about what would be relevant symptoms in relation to a disorder such as depression, we would collate that information and provide that to the team for their consideration and use.
You mentioned depression. Were there any other mental illnesses, disorders, personality types that you provided guidance to the negotiation team about?
Well, high prevalence disorders like depression or anxiety, around substance use would often be a consideration, or around propensity for aggression or for violence.
And what would the nature of your advice be? Just about the illness? Would it involve some advice about how to engage with people with those illnesses?
Look, part of that advice largely would be about anticipated symptoms to expect if they were familiar with the diagnosis that somebody could have, and then potentially how those symptoms might impact a person's performance or communication, and so how the negotiators in that sense might need to consider how they communicate with people if they had a specific disorder.
Now, was that a formalised arrangement or was it pretty ad hoc?
It was a formalised arrangement.
And how frequently would you do it?
Infrequently.
Once or twice a year?
I think at most once or twice a year.
And did you have that kind of arrangement with any of the other police forces or, any other units within the police force?
I think primarily through the police negotiator team, we would provide consultation. So there might be other operations, but that role was to the police negotiator team only.
There's some evidence in this inquest, Mr. Van Heften, that suggests that Kumanjayi Walker might have suffered from a cognitive disability and might have had a history that was consistent with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Do you think that there could be some utility in the ESS providing guidance, not just to the police negotiation team, but to other units, including general duties police officers, about things to be mindful of when you're engaging with someone with a cognitive disability like FASD?
I missed the beginning of your question, but I think I got the gist of it. In relation to is there value for the employee support team or the psychologist on the team providing broader consultation services? But I think there is value in that level of information being available to operational police officers. I'm not sure whether the employee support team is the most functional way to be able to deliver that, depending on the resources that are available, and that in some operational situations the competency might be very different for considerations.
I'll come to the competency and the work that most of the ESS staff do, which I think will clarify the answer to that question. But I take it that you're saying that there would be some value in someone with the appropriate expertise providing that guidance to frontline police officers.
Yes, I think that there's value in that knowledge being incorporated within a policing context.
For example, one of the things that the literature on FASD suggests is that certain types of commands or instructions are more likely to be effective when communicating with someone with FASD.
Yes.
And that other types of commands or approaches might be ineffective. So you've just got to verbalise an answer because we're transcribing the proceedings.
Yes.
And I take it that that's the type of advice you're talking about. It's relatively general things to keep in mind.
So if we thought, for instance, in that example, that there might be an impairment in terms of sequential problem solving, so being able to anticipate what might be a consequence, well then an example of feedback would be provide singular instructions rather than multiple instructions, or assuming that the recipient of the communication could interpret the meaning and work out numerous steps in an instruction.
All right, and providing that advice to police officers could be done in a number of stages, would you agree?
Yes, in a number of different formats.
So you might have some initial training about common mental disorders or substance abuse issues in the Northern Territory that police officers might encounter.
Yes, I think an awareness about high prevalence disorders within the communities that they're policing would be an option.
But equally, you might add simple alerts to offender profiles to put frontline police officers on notice if an offender has a condition like FASD or is known to use volatile substances or cannabis or something of the like.
Sorry, I've missed the first bit of that question.
Sorry, you might reinforce that advice on something like the promise system by adding alerts for offenders where an offender is known to have a cognitive disability or to use volatile substances.
Yes, I think that would make sense if that information was available about specific individuals, that would be relevant for interacting with them.
Just as relevant as the fact that an offender might have a history of committing certain offences.
Yes.
I want to ask you some questions about working with police as a cohort of first responders. In your clinical experience, is trauma common amongst first responders?
I think there's an inherent risk for trauma exposure within first responders, including law enforcement personnel. And I think in my my service provision to law enforcement personnel, I've definitely worked with many where trauma reactions have been an issue that they've sought support for.
And just for clarity, when we talk about those nurses, paramedics, lawyers providing frontline legal services.
Yeah, I would feel comfortable from my experience working with a broader cohort of people to generalise that occupations that have an inherent component around vicarious trauma exposure or direct trauma exposure would also have an increased risk or prevalence of trauma reaction.
You distinguish between direct trauma exposure and vicarious trauma exposure. Are you distinguishing between events where, for example, a police officer is the subject of abuse or violence, and events where a police officer observes, let's say, violence or abuse that's been perpetrated against another person?
Yes, and I'd add to those two circumstances where a police officer might be exposed to information about traumatic circumstances.
So, reading case reports, looking at body-worn video, going to court and
Correct.
hearing evidence, all of those things can be traumatising.
Yes.
Now, you use the expression discrete exposure to traumatic events. Discrete exposure to traumatic events can give rise to conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, is that right?
Yes.
But in the case of police officers, we're also talking about recurrent exposure to trauma, is that right?
Yeah. So ongoing exposure to similar and very different events over the course of their career.
And what's the significance of the recurrence of the exposure to trauma?
Well, I think one element to that is that there might be, due to the frequency of exposure, reduced opportunities for recovery between those exposures. And I think other impacts from that might be through sensitisation or desensitisation to those circumstances. And so having to adapt to the exposure and to be able to continue to perform in a law enforcement role might have some healthy and adaptive consequences and some maladaptive responses to the ongoing trauma exposure.
You used an expression when I met with you and spoke with you yesterday. It was sustained high tempo. Can you recall that?
I've missed your question, sorry.
Sorry. Yesterday when we met, you used an expression, sustained high tempo. What does that mean in the context of exposure to trauma?
Sorry, I heard everything except the expression that you
Maybe you might
Repeat
have
it.
to sit down
Yes, Your Honour.
just so you can get closer to the microphone.
The expression, Mr. Van Haften, was sustained high tempo. And you were describing, I think, a type of work that some frontline or first-line responders do. What does sustained high tempo mean?
I use that considering, well, a high frequency of exposure, not necessarily to trauma, but to stressful and or other distressing events with reduced timeframes between those events for recovery.
And what might the consequences of that be clinically?
Is that people will have less opportunity to return to a baseline in terms of healthy behaviour, and that their stress thresholds might be sustained at a higher level than they're comfortable with, leading to a strain in terms of their adaptive responses to stress and to conditions such as burnout. It might also have an impact in terms of performance, and it may have an impact in terms of how they manage themselves in repeat exposures to stressful events.
You use the expressions sensitisation and desensitisation. if a police officer becomes sensitised to the trauma that they're experiencing directly or vicariously, how might that manifest in changed behaviours?
I think that might manifest in attempt to avoid situations, either through limiting time of exposure or avoidance in general of particular types of situations. It might lead through avoidance by avoiding emotions connected with those particular situations, which might see a resulting numbing or detached response and interaction with people in those situations. There's some common responses that I would have observed.
If a police officer becomes increasingly sensitised to certain types of events, is there a risk that their threat perception might change?
I think the sensitisation is a linkage to an attention to threat, and I think particular situations might be perceived as more stressful or distressing or more threatening in terms of psychological safety.
So, for example, a police officer might over time come to perceive certain conduct by people they're interacting with as more threatening because they're becoming increasingly sensitised to that conduct.
Potentially, yes.
And desensitisation, how might that manifest in changed behaviours?
I think it may, I might have observed it, and in terms of people not appreciating a level of violence or aggression as an example, as being significant because of overexposure to those sorts of circumstances.
And could that include reduced appreciation or a lack of appreciation of their own conduct or the potential consequences of their own conduct?
Potentially.
For example, when using force?
Potentially, yes.
One of the words that you used when we conferenced was the word helplessness. And I wondered whether I might provide you with that word as a cue to say something to Her Honour about one of the effects on a police officer of the type of work that they do in a jurisdiction like the Northern Territory.
Yes, so, Your Honour, I use that phrase helplessness in relation to describing what might be the potential moral impacts of continuing to try and assist and intervene in situations with largely perceived ineffectiveness being able to result in long-term change for individuals or for communities.
Perhaps to give you an example, let's say a police officer over the course of 2 years attended every week at half a dozen reports of domestic violence incidents and kept seeing the same thing again and again and again. Are you saying that they might start to feel helpless or ineffective in their attempts to intervene and solve the very complex problems they were dealing with?
I think that would be a natural consequence for most people attempting to result some change or keep people safe in those situations. And I think that would apply to most police officers as well.
And that, I'm not sure if you just used the term, but there is a risk that a police officer might suffer moral injury as a result of that kind of perception of helplessness.
Yes, correct.
Can you explain to Her Honour what you mean by moral injury?
I would define it, and in terms of my engagement with police officers, as a component of the helplessness to effect change, but
Mr. Van Heften, we've just lost you.
Sorry, the phone call was disconnected.
Oh, we can hear you on Teams.
We'll go with Teams for a little bit, and if that becomes problematic, we'll ring you back.
Can I ask you to start that last answer again? Can you hear us, Mr. Van Heften?
Sorry, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
No, he can't. We're trying to sort that out now. Can you just send him a text to get out of Teams or shut down Teams, and we'll send him another invite? Once we put people on mute, we're having difficulty getting them off mute, which I think is the same problem we had yesterday.
If we just call it back on the line.
Sure, I'll call him back on the phone.
Can you hear me now?
I can. I'm sorry about that. I was asking you a question about moral injury and what it was. Can you explain to her, Honour, what moral injury is?
So I think so really defining exposure, not necessarily including exposure to danger or horrific circumstances, but where trauma exposure is impacting how people perceive a compromise in terms of their own values. And I think circumstances such as ongoing exposure to situations of helplessness would incorporate moral injury for some law enforcement officers.
Is moral injury a clinical diagnosis? Is it a symptom? Is it a philosophical idea?
I'm not an expert on moral injury, and there's growing evidence around both the screening and assessment of moral injury and the domain comprised to that. And I think in the context of policing, there's a growing awareness of the impact of that and how that influences people's recovery and resilience.
How might moral injury change behaviour within a group of police officers?
Before you answer that question, unless I misheard, I think you just said he's not an expert in moral injury. So I'm not sure where this line of questioning can go.
Your Honour, the expert evidence rule doesn't apply in coronial proceedings. He might be able to identify others who have expertise. If there's an objection, if there are to be submissions at the conclusion of the inquest that you should disregard this part of the officer's evidence, then so be it. But ultimately, Your Honour is investigating, not taking evidence in court proceedings. I can ask some probing questions about the basis for the opinion.
Sure. I think he's basing a lot of it on. Obviously, he has his expertise through study and learning, but he's also had many years in the police service and has made his own observations of many individuals, as I understand it. So perhaps if you can establish perhaps a little bit more of a basis.
Mr. Van Haften, you probably heard all of that, but you're obviously speaking about moral injury today. How have you informed yourself about moral injury?
Yep. So yes, I've been asked about moral injury, and I would have informed myself about it, primarily through recognising there's an impact of trauma exposure that's not necessarily specific to exposure to danger or threat, and really it results in a compromise for people in those situations about how they think they can uphold their own values with the tasks or the situations that they've been placed in, and feeling that some personnel and my clients in those situations are compromised in terms of their own values and identity and the task or limitations, what they can do in those situations. And that's why I was suggesting that situations such as helplessness and repeat exposures have a connection to moral injury for some people.
And so it's based, I take it, on your clinical observations in your work as a psychologist over the last 20 years or so.
Correct.
That doesn't solve the issue. You're saying he's not an expert in moral injury. He's basing some conclusions or opinions on lived experience with police officers. How does he come to know what moral injury is? How does he know what it might look like? How does he know how he might see that developing a police officer? Is it through reading literature? Has he been told about it? Has he looked at PowerPoints? Has he gone to lectures? How can he make a conclusion in relation to lived experience with police officers on the topic of moral injury? He's not an expert.
Where are we going with this, Mr. Coleridge?
If Your Honour's not interested, ultimately my examination serves one purpose, which is to inform Your Honour, and I'll move on.
Sure, I'm just not sure where you want to go with it. I mean, I think the concept of sensitisation or desensitisation, ongoing exposure, and that has an impact on human beings is, I think, well understood. The precise mechanics from a psychological point of view, we might not appreciate those niceties as to why it has an impact on us, but I think it would be fairly common knowledge that if you're continually exposed to events that can have an impact on you, the way you view the world, the way you view your own capacity to be effective in the world or effective in your work. So I'm not sure that it takes it very much further.
I'll move on, Your Honour. The only reason I latched onto that word is that there is an expert report on the brief from a Dr. Ned Dobos dealing with moral injury. He's not a psychologist, and it seemed to me interesting that this psychologist had volunteered the term. I'll move on.
Sure.
I want to ask you some questions about any relationship that you have perceived between exposure to trauma or negative interactions with people of particular races and the development of different attitudes towards members of that race. In your clinical experience, is that an issue for first responders if they're having consistently negative interactions with people of one race?
I don't know what the question is, sorry.
Sorry, okay, I'll rephrase it. There's been some evidence in the inquest that in a jurisdiction like Alice Springs, the police overwhelmingly deal with Aboriginal people. The nature of the work that police officers do means that often those interactions are negative. And there's also been some evidence that many of those police officers don't have positive interactions with Aboriginal people in their work outside the police force. From a psychological perspective, can that have an impact on the way police officers perceive members of the Aboriginal race?
I think it could have an impact on how some individual police officers perceive any group that they come into high contact with in terms of representation, whether that's young people, organised crime groups, and I think if law enforcement officers are exposed to a particular cultural or racial group, I would expect that could be an impact where they anticipate a negative interaction.
So because a person has had a large number of negative interactions with people of a particular race, they begin to anticipate that they will have negative interactions each time they're about to interact with a person of that race.
Well, I think my response was broader than just race, and I think if someone's experience is of a representation of a particular cohort of people, well, that will potentially influence how they perceive future interactions, but not be the only factor contributing to their perception and assessment of those situations.
Could that affect threat perception?
Potentially.
How might you address that issue from an institutional perspective? If you were an organisation like the Northern Territory Police Force and you wanted to make sure that, how might you address that issue?
Well, I think some pragmatic strategies might be about helping personnel to be aware of the potential for those sorts of biases to be developed over time through exposure and repeat behaviour. I think another component of it, if it was in relation to working with a particular cohort of people, would be some level of training in relation to that social cohort or cultural cohort, which might be around an improved positive perspective. So around cultural safety training might be appropriate. Incorporating as well what might be some elements of information and experience of why that particular cohort becomes overrepresented in a law enforcement context.
Increasingly, there has been greater awareness in Australia about the potential mental health implications of first responder work. Is that right?
Yes, over recent years.
And in fact, in 2018 and 2019, there was a Senate inquiry into that issue?
Correct. in relation to policing and mental health.
And you were the assistant director of the ESS at that time, is that right? At least for the beginning of the inquiry.
Correct.
And was the Northern Territory Police Force involved in the inquiry?
Yeah. All police forces were, I think, compelled to provide responses to the Senate inquiry.
And some of the data that was provided to the inquiry suggests that there were very high rates of mental illness or distress among cohorts of first responders. Would you agree?
I don't know what evidence was presented, but I would suggest that that type of information would have been conveyed to the Senate inquiry and be part of the basis of the Senate inquiry occurring in the first place.
I want to quickly ask you some questions about processes for dealing with mental health issues within the Northern Territory Police Force. During your time as Assistant Director of ESS, what was available to a police officer who wanted to access some mental health support?
The primary resource within the organisation was the Employee Support Services team, which had a multidisciplinary team, including psychologists, social work staff, rehab consultants, peer support, so lived experience practitioners, and chaplaincy. And within,
Go on.
and from those different positions within the team, there was a range of training, so specifically around mental health literacy training, and over the years that was incorporated in recruit training, and then also additional training courses throughout the organisation. There was crisis support to all employees and their family members as part of the standard employee assistance program. And for personnel, there was a higher level of treatment services available either through brokerage externally or from within the department, including referral to psychiatry services.
How many staff did ESS employ while you were Assistant Director, perhaps at the end of your time in 2018?
Can you just bear with me while I quick math? Approximately 10, including my own position.
And did you have the sense that those services were being accessed? Were you busy?
Yes, all the positions were busy and utilised. I think definitely with the knowledge that there were some people within the organisation that would be reticent to access internal services, and there were barriers to that, challenges to that. But the services were definitely utilised in general by both employees and their family members, as well as volunteers in fire and emergency services.
Do you think that there are barriers to police officers accessing those services?
Yes, I think general barriers, such as stigma, as within the general community. There's inherent barriers around how personnel think accessing support will be perceived from within the organisation, so an additional level in relation to stigma.
Do you think that stigma is an additional issue within the police force, or it's just an issue elsewhere?
I think it's an issue as it is in the community.
Can I ask you some questions about confidentiality? Is when a police officer engages the services of an ESS worker, do they enjoy the same confidentiality that a member of the public would enjoy if they went and saw a private psychologist?
So, in recognition that there's an inherent limitation in providing an in-house embedded health service, otherwise, all of the health information and records was kept separately from any other information or database source within the organisation. And there were protocols around the scope of services, that helps to ensure that as well.
What were the inherent limitations to confidentiality? In what circumstances might you breach confidentiality and inform a managing officer about?
So some pragmatic limitations were that if we were providing a service from within a facility of the organisation, it's possible that clients would be observed accessing those services. That said, the team would have provided many services to personnel in those contexts voluntarily, but that was a barrier for some to access services. In relation to limitations to confidentiality, apart from mandatory reporting requirements within the Northern Territory, duty of care responsibility in terms of the safety of individual clients, as well as the safety of the community in general, saw limitations to confidentiality.
In what circumstances might you breach confidentiality and inform, let's say, a sergeant that one of their constables was suffering from a mental illness?
So a clear-cut one would be if we thought there was risk of suicide or harm to others. That might be a circumstance where, to ensure safety, the organisation would need to be made aware of that. Not all circumstances require that to ensure safety.
What about less acute presentations? Assume, for example, that there was a junior police officer. They had been diagnosed with, let's say, clinical depression. They were being transitioned onto an antidepressant, but they felt well enough to go to work. And you weren't worried that they were at risk of suicide. In those circumstances, would there be any disclosure?
So, not as likely. And I didn't mention earlier on, but part of the context of providing services was that the employee support team didn't provide any fitness for duties assessment, either for return to work or in the context of that. And if they were being prescribed with medication, well, then felt the prescribing doctor, with awareness of what that person's occupation was, also had a responsibility in relation to considering the risk in terms of their occupation and the risk to the community, and would advise around that.
If, for example, you're aware that the police officer was being deployed with a tactical unit, would that affect your decision about whether you needed to disclose to the employer?
So the person's role and the risk that might be posed in relation to community or to themselves or to colleagues in any situation would be a factor for consideration.
I want to ask you some questions briefly about recruiting. I want to transition to the topic of recruitment, but ask you some questions about Australian Defence Force personnel and veterans. Now, understand your evidence to be that there is an inherent risk amongst veterans that there might be some resulting illness or, well, let's just use the word illness. I don't want to use the word moral injury. That there might be some effects of their service as a veteran on them from a psychological perspective. Is that right?
Correct.
But when we talk about inherent risk, we're not assuming that because a person has served in the armed forces that they will have a psychological injury.
That's correct. I wouldn't assume that a veteran has a psychological injury because of their service.
Now, the inherent risk amongst veterans is greater than an ordinary member of the public. Is that correct?
I think research and prevalence rates suggest that some conditions. Correct.
But is it fair to say that in your experience, that inherent risk is roughly the same amongst other first responders like police and paramedics?
I would say from my experience, noting that my professional experience has a limited cohort of people, so people seeking treatment or consulting to, is that similar issues evident for both military veterans and law enforcement personnel, ex-serving personnel within the emergency services as well.
How, if at all, does that inherent risk affect your assessment of a recruit?
Well, that would inform what we think are relevant factors in terms of predispositions, in terms of risk factors. It will also inform the participators the needs of that person if they were employed in terms of themselves, their attitudes, for example, and support. If there's an inherent assumption that they'll be exposed to risk, that could include psychological injury, that would be important. And also about how to support others and support others within that context.
So I just want to clarify, because we lost you, lost bits and pieces of your answer, but if you were aware that a person was a veteran, during the recruitment process, you might try to assess their level of self-awareness about the risk of psychological injury.
Correct.
And you might
Their
try...
own
Go on.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was just going to say their own awareness of the inherent risk with the exposure and their own awareness in terms of their self and how to respond to situations and what they would need to take into consideration in terms of maintain resilience or manage recovery.
I want to ask you some questions about the interview process. Before I do, Your Honour, I just want to raise one issue. I want to ask some questions about the psychometric testing. It wasn't my intention to show the document, but I will need to read parts of the document in order to ask coherent questions about it. Mm-hmm. I just want to confirm that there isn't an objection to me doing that.
There's no objection to that, Your Honour. We were contacted, or my instructor had some contact with the author of that report. If the report were to be shown in court or published on the live stream or published as an exhibit, that would create some intellectual property consequences for him. He's of the view that that represents nearly 30 years of work and is very concerned about competitors having access to those documents. That obviously doesn't fall within Section 43 of the Coronial Act, and therefore Your Honour's powers to make a non-publication order. But given that counsel assisting is proposing to respect the request that's being made, reading a passage or two won't have that, no issue in tackling with that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to make sure. Can I just take you quickly through the timeline? You might remember the dates, you might not. There's evidence before the coroner that Constable Rolfe applied to join the police force on the 9th of February 2016.
Correct. Yep.
Can you just repeat that answer?
Correct. Information application form.
Now, on the 28th of February 2016, he underwent a psychometric assessment by the Australian Institute of Forensic Psychology.
Correct.
On the 16th of March, he underwent an interview. Now, on the morning of the day of the interview, Constable Rolfe filled in a personal history document, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And then he was interviewed from about 10:40 a.m. in the morning.
Yes, that's correct.
And yourself, Senior Constable Kevin Agnew and Superintendent Sachin Sharma were the panellists, is that right?
That's correct.
All right. Now, in Following the interview on the 16th of March, referee and probity checks were conducted, is that right?
Yes, and they would have been completed by the police recruitment team.
And ultimately on the 16th of April 2016, the interview panel, I think, signed a document recommending Constable Rolfe as suitable for recruitment.
So the challenge panel would have signed that document.
I see.
Yeah.
Perhaps if we could have document 8. That's the document you were referring to, is that right?
Yes, correct.
Now, there's a big black redacted panel at the bottom of the page, but if I suggested to you that there are 3 signatures there, is your evidence that they're in fact the signatures of the challenge panel members, not the interview panel members?
Yes, correct.
Okay. The next to the names Sachin Sharma, Kevin Agnew and Bruce Van Haften, there are some comments about Constable Rolfe.
Correct.
And by and large, very favourable or positive comments about his performance at interview, correct?
Correct.
And they were the comments that you produced during or shortly after your interview with Constable Rolfe on the 16th of March.
Yes, correct.
And then ultimately on the 22nd of April, Constable Rolfe was offered employment, is that right?
That appears to be so with the offer of employment.
All right, Beck, we can have that document down. I want to ask you some questions about the psychologist's role in the interview process. Obviously, you have a level of qualification and experience that isn't shared by the other 2 panellists. Is it your evidence that you have a special role on the panel or an equal role to the other panellists?
That I had an equal role in decision making.
And so, in a sense, well, let me put it this way. The panel didn't rely on you to make an independent psychological assessment of Constable Rolfe, did it?
No, it did not.
By convention, the psychologist member would ask certain questions during the interview, is that right?
That's correct.
And is that because, due to the nature of your work, you might be more comfortable or experienced asking sensitive personal questions of a recruit?
Correct.
In terms of the psychometric assessment battery, you had no involvement in developing that, is that right?
That's correct.
You don't know what data went into the report that was generated by the AIFP?
Apart from the items that are noted within
The critical items.
You said apart from the critical items. Now, the critical items are a set of questions that are noted in the report because the answers given by a particular recruit depart from the average. Is that right? Ron, I'm really struggling to hear the witness.
I'm not sure, but unfortunately you're breaking up a lot on the audio now, even on the phone.
I I can hear the voice clearly. Does the proximity of the phone help?
It might help. Try reducing the distance between yourself and the phone.
Okay. But is this better?
That's beautiful.
I think that is better, yes.
Now, you don't happen to have phone headphones by any chance?
I do, but I'll have to connect them wirelessly. I'm not sure if that's going to impact on the other connections going on at the moment.
This is pretty good, so we might just press on, and I'll try to be quick so that we don't wear your arm out. Just quickly, the critical items are a series of questions. You're given the answers as something to test or probe during the interview. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. But otherwise, you don't necessarily know how the scores in the psychometric test were generated.
That's correct.
Okay. I want to ask you some specific questions about what's in that document now. I'm not going to show it to you, but I understand you've got a copy in front of you.
Yes.
Okay. At page 1 of the document, the recommendation is given.
Yes.
And the recommendation is further evaluation with comprehensive report and structured interview. Can you see that?
Yes.
Now, the structured interview is the interview on the 16th of March, is that right?
Correct. It's the interview as part of the framework for recruitment. So similar to the battery and report, that's also part of selection topic and the intellectual property.
Okay. What about the comprehensive report? Is this document the comprehensive report, or is it suggesting that there should be another psychological assessment?
No, this document is a comprehensive report, and that fits further evaluation with comprehensive report and data, and the structured interview is what information is provided to the organisation for all of the candidates that have done assessment prior to the receiving a report. So a component of that is suggesting to the organisation that the outcomes assessment suggests it's worthwhile buying the report from the company because it looks like the data is low risk.
Can you hold that closer? Can you just use it like a normal phone?
Yep.
Okay, see if that works.
Can we have that answer again, please?
I think what he's saying is that they get some information about this report and they're recommending that you get the full report and interview.
That's it. That's correct, Your Honour.
So they get a limited piece of information to say, yes, recommending that you go ahead, get the full report and go ahead with the process, or maybe you don't have to pay all the money for the full report because this is not necessarily a suitable candidate.
That's correct, and that will be on a spreadsheet with the data for every candidate for that recruitment round.
So just to clarify, maybe I'm just missing something. Is this 21-page document from the AIFP the comprehensive report or not?
Yes,
It is.
a comprehensive report.
Okay. Now, Zachary Rolfe was identified as having excellent potential.
Yes, in the report.
Okay. I want to take you just to 3 aspects of the report. Can I ask you to go to page 5?
Yes.
Now, on page 5, the second score, under the heading Working with Others, it's suggested that, a score is given in relation to Constable Rolfe's potential avoidance of accepting responsibility or a likelihood that he might blame others.
Mm-hmm.
And then over on the next page, a potential weakness is identified, and it reads, after making a mistake, Zachary is less likely than many others to accept responsibility. He may brush off the significance of the error, seek to minimise his own role, or blame others. You see that?
Yes. Yep. On page 6 and 7.
There are two other scores that I want to ask you some questions about. I'll just identify them. On page 10 of the document, an aggression score is given. And the interpretation under the heading potential weaknesses reads, the aggression score is above average. Whether Zachary will act with firm assertiveness or frank aggression cannot be determined from this scale alone.
Yes.
Then finally, on page 15 of the report, some additional findings are provided, and under bullet point 4 it reads that Constable Rolfe reports that when he was young his father was very tough on him and his mother tried to compensate by being protective. This pattern has frequently been found to be associated with later resentment of authority figures in highly structured organisations in which employees are expected to comply with strict procedures. In the present case, other data confirm this could be a problem. You see that?
Yes, I do see it.
Okay. What role would those three scores or interpretations have on the subsequent interview process?
Question. What I'm troubled by is that in each of the categories of information, or those three topics that's been put to this witness, in his statement he has qualified each of them by saying this is the interpretive statement within the comprehensive report generated by the AIFP interpretation methodology. The interview panel members do not interpret the data of the psychometric test battery. The interview panel do, however, test these assumptions throughout the behavioural interview process, and if it was further reinforced by any verbal responses at interview, then this would have seen further negative appraisal from all interview panel members. I think the question on focusing on those particular topics when they do not interpret the data, I don't think this witness can answer any question about that.
The question is how those topics affect the conduct of the interview and how they might be addressed in the interview, if at all, as I understand it.
Well, if that's the question.
I thought I clarified that this witness had absolutely nothing to do with producing these statements, but he was armed with them when he conducted the interview. So I think we're on all fours.
What I wonder if you have is how you can have a situation where you don't interpret the data and then how you use those assumptions.
Well, I think he's accepted the data on the basis of this is how the police do the business. Maybe he has certain views as to the reliability or otherwise, which we haven't gone to. But he's armed with this information and it informs the interview process, apparently. So we're just getting to the interview process that this information informs it, and on an assumed acceptance of some weight being given to this testing.
Perhaps I'll put it this way. Did you understand it to be your role as a member of the interview panel to use the AIFP report to assess an applicant during the interview?
Yes, the information from the report was integrated with how the panel would view the responses of each candidate to the complementary behavioural interview guide.
All right. Now, I think as you identify quite clearly in your statement, in a sense, the AIFP report was a black box you didn't know what had gone into it, but you just knew the result it had produced. Is that right?
We use the interpreted data to inform how we can consider the applicant's response to questions at interview.
Okay. And how do you use the interpreted data to assess an applicant's response at interview?
So we would consider what might specifically be risk factors identified in the report, as you have, drawing attention to those key areas. And as we progress through an interview with any candidate, look for evidence of those concerns or risks being highlighted within each response.
And so I think the precise expression you use in your statement is you look to see whether there's further confirmation of the interpreted data in the interview. Is that right?
Correct.
But you're not trying to prove or disprove the correctness of the interpreted data. Is that right?
Correct. We don't modify the interview protocol to interrogate those particular risk factors.
So at the end of the interview, let's say there were no further answers that confirmed that aggression was an issue for the applicant. That wouldn't mean that you'd completely disregard the interpreted data about the aggression score, would you?
Not necessarily.
And it wouldn't mean that the interpreted data was incorrect.
No.
In your statement, I think you say that there should be more integration of recruitment assessments and ongoing training, supervision and assessment of junior police officers. You'd agree?
I'd agree. If there were opportunities to integrate principles and the types of information, that would be useful.
Is data like this, or some of the interpreted data like this, something that could, or in your opinion, should be integrated into ongoing supervision and assessment?
I think, and as consistent to our conference yesterday, that there's difficulties of transferring the data from a psychological report into another context. But I think the principles of what are seen as risk factors, and within this example of the psychometric battery, would be relevant also for ongoing assessment through training and through probationary periods. For instance, attitudes towards authority or aggression would be relevant factors to continue assessing.
So perhaps at the 6 or 12-month mark, you might do further standardised testing to see whether a police officer is consistently scoring high for aggression, for example.
I'm not sure whether there'd be much value for more psychometric testing, but there might be other ways that those risk factors or behaviours could be assessed and observed.
What are those ways?
Through observations of behaviour, through training, through observations of attitudes demonstrated through training.
You say observations of behaviour. If a police officer was developing a reputation for using force inappropriately, is that the type of behaviour that you might use one of these scores to assess?
Yes, so that would be one relevant observation.
I want to ask you some questions about Constable Rolfe's application and the information that was and wasn't provided in it. I might just confirm, I'm getting a lot of post-it notes that objections are being taken to certain documents, and I want to make sure that there is no difficulty with me showing the application form.
Your Honour, I apologise if there's been some miscommunication. I understand the matter I raised earlier to have made it clear that there's a difficulty with showing the report.
That report, no.
Not the report.
About the
Application form.
Application form, I don't think it's good. No, not at all.
Perhaps just while we're on the subject, what about the notes of the interviewing members?
There is a difficulty with notes of the interviewing members, Your Honour. There's a concern about public interest and unity over those materials. If interview questions are shown and published, that may well alert future recruits as to the types of questions to be asked, and then that creates a difficulty with the level of preparation they do and the protections over the process.
So you'd look at online publications.
Your Honour, I think in order to sensibly ask questions of this witness, I'm going to need to identify some of the questions that were asked at interview. I think that...
Well, perhaps you could just, we'll take it sort of question by question. But at this stage, what you would like to bring up is the application form.
That's right.
And there's no issue with the application form.
No.
That's document 2, please, Beck. Can I have page 4, please? Can you see that, Mr. Van Haften?
I can't see it clearly on the screen, but I'll refer to the copy that I've got.
Beck, do you mind zooming in? All right. On the right side of the page, you can see a number of subheadings. Police referee, Defence Force history.
Yes.
Beck, can you please zoom down or scroll down? Now, a little bit further, please. There's a question there. Have you ever been the subject of any complaints, internal investigations, or ever had any disciplinary action imposed on you? And the box is checked no.
That's correct.
And that's directly under the heading, or major heading, Defence Force history. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. I might just ask you to zoom up, please, Beck. To the very top of the page. You can also see there that under the heading Police Service History, the first question, have you previously applied to join the Northern Territory Police Force, is answered no. And the second question appears to have been answered yes, but been crossed out and has subsequently been answered no. Can you see that?
Yes, I can. Correct.
And that second question is, have you previously applied to join any other police service, correct?
Correct.
All right. I now want to ask you some questions about what happened in interview. Your Honour, we've reached the point in my examination where I'm going to have to read a question from the interview. I'm not sure whether there is...
Which question do you want to read?
Your Honour, question... Question 25.
No issue with that, Your Honour.
Oh, my apologies. Question 44, capital B.
No issue with that, Your Honour.
So, at page 26 of your interview notes, question 44 capital B reads, brackets, For applicants with military experience, did you have any disciplinary problems when you served in the military? Do you have an independent recollection of asking that question?
I don't have a recollection, but I would assume, as per convention, that would have been asked by the chair of the panel, who would have been Mr. Sharma.
And the answer that you've recorded in your notes is fine, brackets, fight, no issue.
Mm-hmm.
And do I take it that the answer that was given concerned a fine Constable Rolfe received for a public order type offence in Queensland, in Townsville?
That's how I would interpret my notes and the connection of all of that information.
And that was consistent with something that he told you earlier in the interview in answer to another question.
Correct.
Now, you may or may not have the document in front of you, but Mr. Sharma has also provided us with his notes. And in answer to question 44 capital B, did you have any disciplinary problems when you served in the military? The answer is no.
Yes.
Is that consistent with your recollection, if you have one, that apart from the discussion of that fine for fighting in Townsville, there was no disclosure of any military disciplinary history?
That's what I would assume from the collective notes of the panel members.
All right. Have you subsequently become aware that that might not in fact be true?
Yes, through counsel and through with yourself yesterday.
You're aware that Constable Rolfe was alleged to have committed a military offence of theft?
Correct.
That he went through a military trial?
Yes, as informed by you yesterday.
I might just put these things to you as things for you to assume, but assume that he pleaded guilty to a charge of theft.
Yes.
Assume that he was given a notice to show cause why he shouldn't be terminated as an officer. That he responded and instead of being terminated was put on, in effect, a 24-month probation period.
Yes.
And that the fact that he was on probation was the reason that the ADF cited for not permitting him to join the SAS when he applied to join the SAS.
Yes.
Knowing that, or assuming those facts, how would you characterise Constable Rolfe's failure to disclose this disciplinary history?
The failure to disclose would be questioned, and the relevance for the failure to disclose would be assumed to be deliberate and instrumental, and would be perceived as deceit.
I think the last bit was something about instrumental and deceit. Can you just repeat the answer?
Yes, so it would be perceived as instrumental, so deliberately not disclosing a matter that would have been significant both in military career and very different to disclosing a fight defending another unarmed person in public and getting a fine in relation to that. So there's a significant difference in terms of the disciplinary issue, and that it would have been deliberately withheld as information provided to the organisation and to the panel.
Is that because there's a context of assumed relevance here?
I've assumed relevance and I've assumed significance in the military context as well.
And when you talk about assumed relevance, what you're saying is that you would assume that any person answering these questions would know that the information they had failed to disclose was relevant to the questions they were being asked.
Correct, and to the occupation that they were applying for.
And indeed, those questions were asked on 2 occasions, in the written application and at interview.
Correct. And in the personal history form prior to interview.
And those questions were direct. Did you have any disciplinary problems?
Correct.
Yes. If you had discovered this omission following the interview, would you have recommended Rolf as suitable for recruitment into the Northern Territory Police Force?
If I'd discovered that type of omission for any candidate, it's unlikely that I would have recommended appointment due to the perceived dishonesty and due to the multiple points, even at interview day, of the importance of being honest and forthcoming with relevant information.
This would have been a pretty straightforward case, wouldn't it, if you'd discovered that omission?
I would have assumed so.
I want to ask you some questions about the public order offence matter. I showed you the relevant entry in the application form a moment ago, but in the personal history form, which I won't show because I think it might be subject to the same intellectual property issue, but in the personal history document, at question 1, Constable Rolf was asked whether he had ever been in any type of trouble with the police, and he answered yes.
Yes, correct, at question 3.
And on the next page, at question 18, he was asked, at some time in your life, either as a juvenile or as an adult, have you been spoken to by a police officer for reasons other than a social discussion? And he answered yes.
Yes, that's correct.
And then finally, on page 4 of the document, there's a space that says, in the space below, write down anything else you think is important that the interviewer or the panel should know about you when considering your application. And I won't read the statement in full, but in effect it advises the applicant that this is their opportunity to be honest and to disclose anything, even if it portrays them in a bad light. Would you agree?
That's correct.
That can go up? Okay, I'm told that can go up. Can I please have document 4 back? Yeah. Page 4, please, Beck. Okay. So there's the prompt, and the answer given effectively discloses an account of a fight Constable Rolf says he was involved in April of 2011.
Correct.
And in effect, the account he gives is that he saw a fight, he didn't see how it started, but he saw 3 men beating up a man who was unconscious. He says that he intervened to protect the unconscious man and ended up in the middle of the fight. And when the police arrived, they gave him a public nuisance fine and dropped him back at the Laverack barracks. Okay. Now, this prompted further questions at interview, didn't it?
Yes,
Okay.
and
Sorry, go on what you were about to say.
it came up as a response to the structured questions within the interview.
Okay. And specifically, question 25, and I think Dr. Freckleton said that this question was okay. There were questions about whether or not Constable Rolfe had ever been in a physical fight, and he provided some answers that were broadly consistent with what he put in the personal history document. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. I want to provide you with an additional fact, which is that on the 8th of February 2016, the day before his Northern Territory application, Constable Rolfe had applied to join the Queensland Police Service. Were you aware of that?
Just by the information within the personal history form.
Okay. On the 7th of March, so this is about 10 days before his interview, Constable Rolfe was contacted by the Queensland Police Service, was informed that he had failed to disclose the public order offence, and that, and I'm quoting, the failure to disclose this matter was an integrity breach, and that he was excluded from reapplying for the Queensland Police Service for 10 years. Now, were you aware that he had been excluded from reapplying to the Queensland Police Service for 10 years on the 16th of March when you interviewed Constable Rolfe?
I'd assume that the panel wasn't aware.
You'll recall that on page 4 of the personal history document, above that longer statement, there's a question, do you have any pending applications with any other police service? And Constable Rolfe answered that he had a pending application with the Queensland Police Service.
Yes.
To your mind, would that have been accurate in light of the fact that his application at that point in time had been rejected and he had been told that he should not reapply for 10 years?
Well, based on the additional information that you provided, it would make sense that his application was not pending. It had been discounted by the Queensland Police.
And to the extent that there was any confusion about what the word pending meant, would it have been your expectation that he would provide some additional information about the Queensland application in that narrative section towards the bottom of the page?
I think in relation to pending, most applicants understand that to be, I've applied for a job and the outcome has not been arrived at. I've not been told that I don't have the job or my application is not being considered, or I'm awaiting some level of outcome from the application.
Had you become aware that Constable Rolfe's application with the Queensland Police Service was not in fact pending, but had been rejected for an integrity matter, would that have been relevant to your assessment of his application at interview on the 16th of March?
It would have been relevant in the context of why was it not proceeded with by Queensland Police and why was it considered an integrity issue? And it would have also been relevant in the context of information potentially being withheld that would be considered relevant for his application with the NT Police.
Your Honour, I have a bit more on this topic. I'm conscious that I've been going for a while and it's probably been a difficult examination for everyone to listen to.
We will take a 15-minute adjournment.
All stand, Coronial and temporary adjourn.
Such a
Those two.